And it's truly my great pleasure and delight to be able to now double the journalistic presence on this podium. We've been outnumbered by the scientists and researchers and economists and academics. And now to then welcome one of the most influential and celebrated journalists of our time, Nicholas Kristof, a columnist of the New York Times. And Nick is someone who many of you know through his writings, but now we're very fortunate to have him here in the flesh. And so the photo that you see by his column or on the online, here he is. And I'll say Nick, as I said, one of the most celebrated journalists of our time and influential. Nick has won not one, but 2 Pulitzer Prizes. In 1990, Nick and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn, then also a Times journalist, won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. And very interesting, they were the first married couple to win a Pulitzer for journalism. Nick also won a second Pulitzer in 2006 for commentary for what the judges called his graphic, deeply reported columns that at personal risk focused attention on genocide in Darfur and, these are important words, and gave voice to the voiceless in other parts of the world. Nick's also won a boatload of other prizes, including the George Polk Award, Overseas Press Club Award, Michael Kelly Award, and I guess in a sign of our new journalism world, the Online News Association Award. Nick and Cheryl, they're authors of China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power, and Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia, and most recently, Half the Sky, From Oppression to Opportunity for Women Worldwide. Now, speaking from experience, I know just how singular and powerful Nick's voice is and has been over the years and continues to be, and how valuable his work is to go to places other journalists don't go, to write about issues that other journalists ignore, and, as was said by the Pulitzer Committee, to give voice to the voiceless. So, Nick Kristof, thank you.
Appreciate that. Sure. Thank you. Thanks so much. And it was kind of appropriate that the word bogus came up right before I arrived on stage, because when the conference staff stepped out, I immediately became the person in the room who knows the very least about nutrition here. But what I do know a little bit about is about putting issues on the agenda. So let me talk a little bit about that. I think it's been enormously frustrating for all of us that so many of these issues that are just so vital to improving global health and development outcomes get so little traction on the global stage. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them, frankly, has to do with us in the news media. There are a lot of issues that we don't hugely distinguish ourselves in covering, but maybe the single issue that we cover worst is public health around the world. And part of that is that we tend to be best in the news media at covering something that happens on a particular day. We tend to be worse at covering things that happen every day. And so a plane crashes, we're all over it. Kids don't get enough vitamin A, we completely miss it. There's no day in which it's news. But if we in the news media drop the ball on these issues, then I also think it's important to note that I think that the humanitarian community has often been extraordinarily bad at marketing itself. Every day as a journalist, I get pitches from companies trying to sell products that don't matter a whit to the world. And they're incredibly well marketed. You just kind of get the feeling that unless you immediately go out and buy this gadget, boy, you've missed the boat. And meanwhile, on issues that really matter to the world, whether it's education, empowerment of women, micronutrients, then you don't have anything like the same force of marketing. And in fact, I think there's often a sense among the kind of do-gooder community or the humanitarian community that almost to flinch at marketing, to feel, oh, that's what mercenary corporations do, but we have a really valuable product. But of course, at the end of the day, it's far more important to market vitamin A or zinc or iron than it is to market Coca-Cola. And I also think that, at the end of the day, we really can make a difference on these issues. And if you look at those public health issues, for example, that really have gotten traction, they've gotten there because they had constituencies that really pushed for them. Why is it that you can go to some remote part of Zambia and see American-funded programs to provide antiretrovirals at considerable expense to remote populations, but you don't see programs to provide, say, zinc or vitamin A supplements in those places, even though it's incredibly cheap, or iodine? Well, it's because there are real constituencies there for AIDS in a way that has not been true of nutrition. Likewise, in more recent years, malaria, the malaria community, I think, has really kind of figured out how to market malaria, how to get school kids excited about malaria. Partly that was about slicing and dicing it into bed nets, so people could feel that they could buy a bed net, and for $5 or $10 they could help save a kid's life. It was shrewd marketing, I think, and getting the word out. The anti-pneumonia is an interesting case because it's been an ailment that has been enormously ignored. And just in the last year or so, you have a group of people who are very shrewdly trying to figure out how to jump up and down and get attention to pneumonia in the same way. Maternal mortality has been getting more traction in the same way. Part of that was about trying to figure out a way of again, putting a human face on it, and part of that was to focus on obstetric fistulas as a entry point. A woman who's got, there's nothing sadder than a woman or a girl who suffered a fistula. It is something that can be solved for a few $100s, and the ways to prevent an obstetric fistula are essentially the same ways you prevent maternal mortality. But it becomes something that you can kind of put your arms around rather than this big, huge issue of maternal mortality. Now, my own interest in these issues of kind of getting attention really arose when I was incredibly frustrated columnist trying to get more attention to Darfur. I went out time and again back in when the Darfur crisis was starting back in 2004, and saw scenes that just seared my conscience, and I would write column after column, and it felt they were just disappearing in the pond without a ripple. And I don't know if you remember, but at least those of you who maybe lived in New York at the time, you may remember that there was a big hullabaloo at the time because there were a pair of red-tailed hawks living in Central Park then. One of them was called Pale Male. And those hawks were living in an apartment building right next to Central Park. And the management of that apartment building thought that there were too many bird droppings, and they pushed out these two red-tailed hawks. All of New York got up in arms about two homeless red-tailed hawks. And I couldn't believe that here I am writing about tens of thousands of people being slaughtered at that point, and hundreds of thousands driven from their homes, villages burned, unbelievable atrocities. And I couldn't get the same traction for that as two red-tailed hawks could get, two homeless red-tailed hawks. And so that led me to look at this question of what builds connections with readers. And I turned in particular to neurology and social psychology. And in each field, the lessons tend to be quite similar and reinforcing. And it's that, by and large, the pathways to care are essentially governed by the emotional parts of the brain. And once that pathway is opened, then the brain looks for rational reasons to support its judgment. But it starts with that emotional connection, not a rational connection. And secondly, there's a scholar called Paul Slovic who has done a lot of particularly interesting work in writing and experiments on these questions. And one of the ways to build that emotional connection is that it's all about individual stories. Mark Cohen talked earlier about the narrative, putting a face on these problems. It's it's very true, and it's about an individual face. And we all sort of know intellectually that at some point, as the number of victims grow, then victims kind of fade into this big amorphous anonymous class of victims, and that sense degrades. That, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Well, the point at which empathy begins to diminish, that you have diminishing returns, is when n, for the number of the class of victims, when n equals 2. The moment you move beyond 1, you begin to see less empathy, less interest. And there have been a series of, essentially this was tested with a bunch of experiments, typically involving a picture of a 7-year-old girl from Mali named Rokia who was suffering from malnutrition. And everybody, when they hear Rokia's story, they want to help Rokia. The moment you start talking about malnutrition more broadly in the Sahel, or even the moment when you add a 7-year-old boy from Mali and add him to the picture, then interest in helping diminishes. Now, one can deal with that. One can start with those individual stories, and once that pathway is built and people care, then you can begin to add some context, some information, and get people to help. But it starts with that individual. And in my reporting, so much of what I try to do is go out and find the perfect anecdote, the perfect human face to put on that larger problem. The second lesson from this kind of research is that people want to be a part of something fundamentally happy and reassuring and positive. And that often and especially in the nutrition world, what the humanitarian world and NGOs and to some degree the UN have done is focus on, the classic starving child with flies in the eyes. And that tends to be something of a turnoff. It's okay to explore and plumb the depths of really terrible things that are happening, but you want to show a trajectory out of that to show that one can make a difference and leave a much better outcome. And I think that it may be that NGOs and this broader kind of humanitarian sector have sometimes overdone the emphasis on suffering around the world and underemphasized the degree to which there really has been progress on so many issues. I mean, I think that in America, at least, there is a widespread misperception that Africa has essentially been a hopeless case, that child mortality is just an unending problem, when in fact, of course, the number of deaths globally before the age of 5 has dropped from 20 million in 1960 to about 8 million today. At the same time, and the population base of that age cohort has dropped extraordinarily. There's been huge progress in issues like child mortality, but I think that in seeking funds, groups have often emphasized the cup half empty rather than the considerable progress. And I think that ultimately has probably been a strategic mistake in trying to spread the word. A couple of warnings. One is that the media disinterest in some of these issues may actually get worse. The news media are struggling for a business model. Right now, whether it's television, radio, newspapers, we really don't have one. Everybody is cutting costs desperately. And traditionally, there was some sense that, well, an important story, we're going to cover it whether or not readers really care about it so much or not. I think that has been fading, especially for television. And everybody has been cutting overseas coverage in particular. The truth is that if you're the executive producer of a television show, then you can send a camera crew off to Rwanda and DRC to write about biofortification and beans with a lot of iron in them, and your ratings will drop. Or you can put a Democrat and a Republican in a room together and have them yell at each other, cost nothing, and your ratings will go up. And that's the fundamental challenge that we face. And it's going to be incumbent upon journalists to do a better job in telling that story. And, I think a lot of journalists went into the business because we do feel that we do want to make a difference in the world. And I think it's important to hold our feet to the fire. But I think that also the nutrition community has to do a better job of trying harder to sell its story. I think on top of this problem of fading business model and a desperation for ratings is the fact that I fear that in the U.S. at least we may be moving toward a period where we're becoming more insular generally. After 9/11, there was a time when we were truly very globally engaged, partly because of the Afghan war, the Iraq war, because of terrorism concerns, and there really was a lot of global interest. I wonder if, given the recession, whether we're not only seeing a cyclical downturn in that kind of global interest, but also really a secular change and a return to the much more typical situation in the U.S. where we essentially really don't pay much attention at all to anything beyond our borders. And that, in truth, has been the situation for most of American history. I fear that to some degree we're returning to that. I think it's going to be a lot harder to justify development aid in the future. There was an effort in the U.S. Congress by Republicans to strip away the Israeli aid from the rest of the foreign assistance budget, and I presume that that was so that people could make a very public effort to oppose foreign assistance without being vulnerable to the accusation that they were undermining Israel's security. I think it's going to be really important to make that case for international engagement and foreign aid, and I don't know that that's going to be in the interest of a lot of politicians. If you think about President Obama, this is something that I think he deeply believes in. His mother, of course, was a pioneer in microfinance in Indonesia. He cares about these issues, and you have not seen the White House make a major, push this issue very much because it's not something where there are political returns to it at this time. And that, again, I think makes it incumbent on those of us who care about these issues to push them a lot harder. Let me tell you a little bit about my own, struggles to try to do this. I've tried in various ways to try to preach beyond the choir. One of the things I've done is my annual Win a Trip contest, where I have a contest to take a student with me on a reporting trip to Africa to write about development issues. The idea is that creates a certain amount of buzz among students who compete for the contest to win the contest, and then the student will blog and video blog. As we go, it also, students may tune me out, but they may be a little more interested in listening to a student talk about it. And it also is a way of confronting some of these very basic development issues, the things that happen every day, on the excuse that I'm sort of showing them to this student. And another, I've tried to sometimes use the celebrity spotlight as a way of getting attention on these issues. Went through Eastern Chad and the Darfur border once with George Clooney, and people maybe. I think there were a lot of people who didn't care a whit about Eastern Chad, but cared about George Clooney, and you could sort of drag them into the issue by that way. And I think, and likewise in our book, Half the Sky, my wife and I really, we used the book was really kind of a way of experimenting with these lessons from social psychology and using individual stories to try to bring people into important public health and female empowerment issues. And also trying always to end with a hopeful note that terrible things happen, but one can make a difference. And it's been very exciting to me that message has resonated, and I think for Cheryl and me, especially when we lecture at universities, it always strikes me that there are often young women who come up afterward and they'll say, "Mr. Kristof, I just want you to know that I read your book and I've quit my job, and next week I'm moving to Philippines, Uganda, Peru, whatever it is." And, their parents are sometimes in the background looking daggers at me. I do think sometimes it is possible, to engage on these issues. It's hard to get people to care about these issues who wouldn't otherwise do so. It's hard, but it can be done. In the case of Half the Sky, our next step has been working on a 4-hour television documentary on the issue because, at the end of the day, to buy a book on a subject, you have to have some pre-existing interest in it. You can watch a TV documentary by mistake, and and the documentary will have, again, various celebrities in it to try to drag people in who don't otherwise care about it. We're also going to use a game, a free online game, and because again, there's incredibly low barriers to entry if it's a non-didactic game. People will play it for fun, and then they can get dragged into these issues. I'm sure some of you know the game Food Force, which was one of the early efforts to get kids involved in looking at global nutrition and food aid issues through a game that was just fun. And nobody thought when Food Force was first introduced that it would be nearly as popular as it was. Social media, I think, are going to end up being part of this. Even if the news organizations aren't out there covering these issues, there are a lot of aid workers out in the middle of nowhere. And if some of them have flip cameras, they can do videos. Most of them, nobody will watch but their parents, maybe. There will be one or two that will somehow be incredibly funny or whatever and will go viral. And I think it's important to try to experiment with those things. My hunch is also that more foundations are going to end up supporting some some of these journalistic ventures in these areas. The New York Times isn't going to accept foundation money to cover a particular topic because we perceive it as a conflict, but already the Gates Foundation, for example, is subsidizing some network television coverage of global health issues. I think that's going to happen more, and from my point of view, if that is a way of getting these issues more in the global agenda, more power to it. A couple of other issues, let me just briefly mention. I do think that if one's thinking about marketing these issues, then one has to really think seriously about the naming issues. I agree with the notion that bio is a impediment in biofortification, and almost every bio association is raises some alarm bells. Also things like biowarfare, biohazard. If you think about vitamin enrichment, for example, maybe less technically accurate, but is something that may have warmer associations. Micronutrients, again, I think, it's just not a. It's hard to write engaging. It's hard to imagine TV, the Today Show, doing a segment on micronutrients just because it sounds very scientific and problematic. I always thought that the MDGs were a problem because, that if you'd had a bunch of smart marketers coming up with MDGs, they would have been called something much snappier. There would have been a few of them that everybody could remember, and that instead, one of the reasons the MDGs did not get more traction with the public was the way they were essentially devised to be comprehensive and, by very smart people who weren't really thinking about the marketing consequences. One tip as well that, I think that we journalists often have our, that when people approach us and want to tell us success stories in development, we, alarm bells go off because every NGO in the history of the world has claimed that its interventions are successful. And the evaluations are often so extraordinarily unrigorous that you tend to be quite deeply suspicious. I mean, IFPRI and others have in fact done some incredibly rigorous and important evaluations, and those really, and randomized controlled trials are things that can really give us confidence and make us feel that, well, there is something to this. But just talking up an intervention, once competing with 1,000 others that are all saying that their intervention is the best. I think that also, at least for me, one wants people who really know the situation at the grassroots, but also at 30,000 feet. And there are not a lot of people who have that combination. I tend to be somewhat suspicious of macroeconomists, for example, because they may know the databases incredibly well, but it's those microeconomists who've actually spent a frustrating couple of years on their dissertation in the middle of nowhere, realizing that nothing works as planned, who often have sort of richer insights into some of these issues. And so getting that combination of grassroots and treetops, I think, is important for telling the story persuasively. And just maybe most important of all, this question of trying to figure out how to put a face on these issues. And it's obviously very hard in the world of nutrition, that it's not easy to know who is a victim, if you will, of a present situation, of an existing situation. It's hard to know who has been a beneficiary of providing vitamin A, for example. Some of that may be about putting a face on some of the people out there doing the work. In Britain, during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the first campaign slogan was about to free the South African political prisoners. And it just never really resonated much with the public. And then it became Free Mandela. And that did. Once you had a human face on apartheid, then it had broader traction. I think likewise that Jim Grant, for example, when he was at UNICEF, the fact that you could put a human, who was rushing around, making a huge difference in child mortality, that helped tell that story. And so whether that human face is somebody doing the interventions or whether it's a kid out there in the middle of nowhere who's getting that, that sweet potato, whatever it may be, I think that is going to be the key for us. And so, and it may be that making this in part a security issue may help too. And people tend to flinch at that. But at the end of the day, especially if we in America turn more insular, then the one thing that is going to get funded is going to be the Pentagon. The American military has more people in its bands than the State Department has in the entire Foreign Service. And if one can encourage the Pentagon to think about nutrition as a security issue, to think about Afghanistan, Pakistan in particular, Somalia, other places where they're particularly worried, Yemen, to think about some of these issues, then enough money could fall off some random Pentagon truck to fund USAID for years. So I think we need to try to think in creative ways about all these issues. And at the end of the day, that is what is going to get your work traction, get those sweet potatoes and beans out there, making a difference in kids' lives, and ultimately saving a lot of kids' lives all around the world. Thank you very much, and happy to make this a conversation.